Et sige, ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng complement system? So 'pag sinabi natin complement system, it is typically a group of proteins that are responsible for ano, responsible for, elucidating a certain immune response. So, si complement system para na siyang part ng innate, pero at the same time para din siyang part ng adaptive immunity kasi meron tayong involvement of your antibodies. And sometimes hindi lang din antibodies ang important in activating your complement, but also the different characteristics or structures of your foreign materials or foreign pathogens. Kasi just like in your phagocytosis, merong mga components ang bacterial cell wall or bacterial cell membrane or mga other microorganism na mga membrane that can be identified by our immune system as an invader. So hindi siya part ng ating body. So i-a-attack niya. So yun yung isa sa mga immediate response with regards to identification kahit pa walang previous exposure. However, just as in any immune reaction, 'pag merong ita-try na patayin yung ating, immune system na foreign material, hindi ibig sabihin yun lang yung made-destroy. So, kasama meron niyang casualty na part of our normal body system. Again, so ano nga ang complement? So they are a group of protein or a series of serum proteins that are activated or are present during an inflammatory response. So ilan ba yung alam natin na complement proteins? Third year, hindi ko kayo makita. Nasaan kayo? Sino ang nagamit ng ano, camera? Sige. Ayan lang itong kay ano, kay bossing. Sige. So, ano nga, ilan nga yung alam natin na complement proteins? Kahit na hindi magsalita kasi kaya pa yun ng fingers. Ilan? Meron bang nagre-raise ng hand dito? Ilan yung alam yung series of protein under the complement system that are actually part of the cascade? So, tama. Kung sino man yung nag-isip, nakaabot sa akin, 9 ang complement protein. So, sabi, these complement proteins, they are activated and the aim is to destroy the foreign material or yung pathogen. So, meron tayong three general pathways of our of our complement, which we will discuss later. So, sa ngayon, um, wait. Sige. Sa ngayon, overview ulit, ano yung two types of immunity natin? Meron tayong natural and adaptive immunity. So, si natural, yun yung non-specific innate, hindi kailangan ng prior exposure. Si adaptive, acquired specific, yun yung kailangan ng prior exposure kasi nga specific. So, lahat ng types of immunity can be categorized into two. Isa humoral, isa cellular. So, sino sa dalawa yung may involvement of the phagocytes or immune cells? Humoral or cellular?
Cellular.
Si cellular. Pero nag-iiba lang sa type ng cells involved. Kung natural, yun yung mga non-specific cells na kayang pumatay. So, yun yung mga warrior natin, neutrophil, macrophage, natural killer cells. Pag cellular naman ng acquired or adaptive, it is specific. So, sino ba yung mga matatalinong cells natin ng immune system? T cells or your T lymphocytes of the different categories and then yung B cells din. So, they are involved in the whole immunity ng adaptive system. Pero si B cells, kahit na cell siya, mas malaki yung role niya in the humoral part of the immunity. So, si humoral ng innate, diba? Basta to. What is it? Unsa to, Tran? Nakaka-gusto i-comment?
I
Wala?
can do. I know, no, I'm not kidding.
Ha? Nakuratan ako ang kaluluwa. Sige, humoral ng ating natural, immunity mostly involves mga cytokines na non-specific complement proteins. So, kahit na may involvement tayo ng antibody, yung complement proteins can be considered as a humoral version of the natural or innate non-specific immunity. So, kasama na diyan yung mga interferons and lysozymes. So, yung mga lysozymes, saan ngang part yan ng immunity? Sa phagocytosis. So, tumutulong sila na i-destroy kung ano man yung nakain ng phagocytes natin. Tapos sabi kanina, bakit humoral yung mga B cells? Eh, cells nga sila. Kasi sila yung nagre-release ng mga antibodies. So, anything that are substances, para mga fluid-like proteins, so under sila sa humoral part of our immune system. So, overview lang to kasi nag-aral naman kayo nito last meeting na master na ang natural and adaptive humoral cellular na classifications. So, yung complement proteins natin are activated by different methods. Pero even if they are capable of killing microorganisms, they are also not stable pagdating sa heat. So during um, examination, they are heat labile, so they can be destroyed under intense heat. Pero hindi naman din aabot sa 56 degrees Celsius yung mga katawan natin. So, it's not a factor in terms sa ating body, but in terms of examination. Okay. So, meron tayong immune serum and non-immune serum. So, heat labile component of our immune serum will be complement. Still, non-immune serum, heat labile component are the complement. So, sino na part ng humoral natin ang heat stable? Yung mga antibodies. So they are somehow heat stable, capable of undergoing or withstanding intense amount of heat. So again, your complement system are a group of serum and cell surface proteins. So na-activate, pag sinabi nating C proteins dito or anything na C, complement related yun. So na-activate sila due to mediators or presence of structures of organisms like cell wall, ganun. May mga nakaka-activate ng complement system. So, sila ang major effector ng innate humoral. So, ano yung mga biological functions ng ating complement system? So, primarily, they are responsible of lysis of the pathogen. Next is opsonization. Ano nga yung sabi ni Sir Red about opsonization? Ano yung function niya?
Parang tagging po, no?
Okay. Tagging of the pwedeng bacteria, pwedeng other types of organism. So, tagging, nakita niyo dyan, parang may color red na flag. So, i-cover niya yung organism para ma-identify ng phagocyte na ay abnormal to. Okay? So, aside from that, yung complement natin na mga proteins can also help in the activation of the inflammatory response. So, anong mga parts of activation ng inflammatory response? So, pwedeng pag nag-attach siya doon sa phagocyte or immune cell, mas capable si immune cell magkaroon ng extravasation or pagpapunta siya doon sa site of injury or site of inflammatory process, anong tawag doon? Anong tawag doon sa process na mag-undergo siya doon sa ano, blood vessel?
Ano ang batas sa do?
O yung lalabas na siya.
Ano, diapedesis?
Okay, diapedesis. So aside sa diapedesis, 'pag nag-attach din yung complement protein doon sa mga immune cells natin like basophil or mast cell, nagkakaroon ng triggering of degranulation. So nare-release nila yung mga histamine, so yung allergic response natutulungan, nakaka-call sila ng mga um, cytokines or interleukins to attract other cells. And lastly, pwede rin silang tumulong in clearance of immune complex. So always remember, pag merong immune complex, antibody antigen, na-detect yan ng immune system, tatawag talaga yan ng inflammatory response. Whether in ganun kalaki or ganun ka-severe or mild, pero it will cause an immune reaction. So, dyan din umiikot minsan yung pathogenesis ng other mga autoimmune diseases kasi there are times that um, we are able to produce antibodies against our own antigens. So, di ba dapat hindi? Ang antibodies para sa non-self. Pero pagka nalito yung immune system, uy, gumawa ng antibody, papunta sa antigen ng ating own tissues, tas nagkabit yan sila, ay may dumikit na complement. Pag may dumikit na complement, lalong tatawag yan ng whole inflammatory response instead na wala sanang pathogen na nakapasok, ang nade-destroy is yung ating own tissues. So, always remember, pag may immune complex na nabuo, most of the time, if not all of the time, it will call a complement activation or elicit an immune response. So, that's why minsan mas um, mas evident or mas may moderate symptoms, if not severe, ang second dengue kesa sa first because of previous coating. Okay? So, ano yun? Pwede silang maging um, lysis ng cell, opsonization, pwedeng activation of the immune response like diapedesis or degranulation, and they can aid in the clearance of immune complexes. Okay? Sige. So, 'di ba sabi natin kanina, we have several pathways of the complement system. So, yung complement natin, hindi yan na-activate just by one pathway or one way. Meron tayong tinatawag na classical, meron tayong alternative, and meron tayong lectin pathway. So, minsan meron din tayong additional na name sa lectin pathway, yung mannose binding lectin pathway. So, out of the three, parang tina-term si lectin pathway as the most ancient of the three pathway. Ancient meaning yung mga little evolutions that happen overall sa humans or sa mga bacteria. Nauna yung discovery and elucidation of lectin pathways compared sa classical and alternative. So let us differentiate the three. Pag sinabing lectin pathway, yun yung main pathway in which our complement system is being activated by an antibody directed mechanism. So, si classical pathway is the main antibody directed mechanism for triggering complement activation. So, dito nakalagay, initiated daw by binding C1 to CH2 domains of IgG and CH3 domains of IgM. So, this is considered a mechanism of your humoral immunity. Pag alternative pathway naman, this is activated through microbial surface. So, hindi natin kailangan ng antibodies. Pag na-detect ng system yung um, component of the bacterial cell membrane na activates si alternative pathway. So, it is still an effector of your innate immune system. So, this is an example of the antibody binding the certain region or epitope of your antigen. So, sabi natin sa classical, this is the main antibody-directed mechanism. Pero, ilang bang type of antibodies meron tayo? 5. And out of all the antibodies na types natin, meron pa yung sub-classifications yung mga antibodies natin. For example, IgA1, IgA2, ganun. Pero ang mga antibodies daw natin, sometimes, selected lang sa kanila yung capable of triggering the classical pathway. So, sino lang yun? Si Ig? Dalawa lang yun dyan, no? IgM and si IgG. Okay. So, si IgM kasi malaki siya, it is a pentamer, so kaya niyang mag-activate ng even dalawang antigen, kaya niyang maka-activate ng complement system because of its structure. So, kahit isang molecule lang ng IgM, kaya na niyang mag-trigger ng classical pathway. Pero si IgG kasi maliit lang siya, minsan kailangan niya pa ng dalawang IgG molecule binding to a single antigen or antigenic structure so that it can trigger the activation of the complement pathway. And hindi rin lahat ng IgG capable of activating yung ating classical pathway. Ang kaya lang is IgG1, 2, and 3. So, out of the 3 types of IgG na kayang mag-trigger ng classical pathway, ang best elucidator ng classical pathway, si IgG3. Okay? So, ang isa lang na mga special power ni IgG is kaya niyang pumunta sa placenta and pumunta doon sa fetus. Kaya kahit na nakatago sana yung fetus doon sa uterus ng mama, if nakalusot si IgG tas nakabind siya ng antigen, pwede rin siyang mag-elucidate ng immune response. So, yun yung isa sa mga mechanisms bakit nagkakaroon ng attack ang mother immune system against sa fetus. Kasi meron tayong pabibo na antibody which is your IgG. So, those are the different activators of your classical pathway. Even there are also studies that will say na for an IgG to maximally activate the complement system, kailangan daw 6 talaga yung nakabind. Pero syempre hindi naman natin yun kailangan i-count unless mag-study talaga kayo ng antibody and immunological na molecular procedures. Next is your lectin pathway, which is triggered by binding of the plasma mannose binding lectin natin to the mannose residues na nandoon sa microbial proteins and polysaccharides. So, meron tayong mannose binding lectin sa plasma natin. So, mannose binding lectin, by its name na mannose binding lectin, magbabind siya sa mannose na nandoon sa microorganism. So, yung mannose is one of the sugar components of your microbes. And once that it binds, yung MBL magbabind sa mannose, so para siyang antigen-antibody complex na magte-trigger ng immune response. Okay? So, it is still a parang pathogen-associated molecular pattern or PAMP that will allow activation of the lectin pathway. So, ganito yung complement activation. Classical, kailangan ng antigen-antibody complex mannose binding lectin or lectin pathway, kailangan nag-bind si lectin doon sa surface. And alternative pathway na trigger sa pathogen surfaces. Example, mga lipopolysaccharide. So, ang endpoint ng complement activation, recruitment ng inflammatory cells, opsonization, and killing of pathogens through cell lysis. So, ano yung nangyayari pag meron tayong classical pathway? So, during activation of classical pathway, kailangan meron tayong antigen-antibody complex. So, the existence of your antigen-antibody complex will activate the first complement component, which is C1. Okay? So, C1 yung first na activate. Nandyan sa number 2, formation of the C1 complex. So, dito, ang ating complement proteins are named as C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And it was named as such because of the discovery. So, hindi porket C1 siya, I mean C2 siya, siya na yung next kay C1. It does not necessarily follow that way. C2 lang siya kasi second siya na na-discover na complement protein. Pero dito, C1 yung first, C1 din yung first na discover. So again, meron tayong antibody nag-bind sa antigen. Classical pathway ha. Tapos yung presence of an antigen-antibody complex will be recognized by our immune system. So meron tayong C1 which will recognize the presence of that antigen-antibody complex. Pero yung C1 natin, hindi siya basta C1 lang. It is a complex of protein which is C1q, C1r, and C1s. So, cascade din yan. So, number 2, yung number 2 dyan, yung C1q, yung yellow, i-activate niya si C1r, tapos i-activate niya si C1s, tapos together, they are known as the C1 complex. So, nag-bind na sila kay FC region ng antibody. So, yan na yung first step. So, ang tawag dyan sa first stage of the complement na classical, nabuo yung recognition unit. Kasi na-recognize na yung presence ng antigen-antibody complex. Ngayon, after the appearance of the C1 complex, magkakaroon tayo ng activation ni C4, and then ma-activate si C2, and then that will form overall the activation unit together with the C3. So, ulit si C1 complex nag-bind doon sa FC region ni antibody. Tapos ngayon, na-trigger niya ang C4. So, si C4 naging activated C4. Pero ang activated C4, meaning na-cleave si C4 into 2, C4A and C4B. Kaya ang nag-bind dyan is si C4B. So, ang activated form ni C4 is C4B. So, nag-bind siya doon. Tapos, yung activation ni C4B will be triggering also the activation of the C2 component. So, yung C2 ngayon will be cleaved into 2 subproteins, C2A and C2B. Pero ang didikit kay C4B is si C2A. So, BA. C4B, C2A. So, complex na yon. Pag nag-bind si C4B and C2A, may special name yan silang dalawa. Ang tawag dyan sa C4B and C2A na complex is the C3 convertase complex. So, from the name na C3 convertase, meaning yung combination nila both will activate C3 or will cleave C3. Okay? Sige. Ulit, C1 naging C1 complex yung QRS. tapos yung presence niya will serve as an enzyme that will cleave or activate C4. Pagkatapos ni C4, ma-activate siya, ang kukunin lang natin para mag-bind is si C4b. Tapos si C4b will activate C2. Ang kukunin natin kay C2 is si C2a. So C4b and C2a combined is termed as your C3 convertase. Kino-convert niya si C3 into 2. C3b and C3a. Pero ang kukunin natin doon is si C3b. So, ngayon yung C3b binding to the C4b, C2a is considered as one of the most significant steps in the classical component activation. Kasi yung cleavage niya from A to B will also make it as a complex enzyme. So, magiging C4b, 2a, 3b. So, meron din yan silang pangalan. Ang pangalan nila, C5 convertase. Kasi yung C5 convertase, it will trigger the activation of C5. Okay? So, in terms of number, ang ating organization sa classical component is C1, C4, C2, C3. So, doon lang tayo disorientation. Instead na 2 ang kasunod ni 1, 4 ang kasunod. So, C4, C2, C3. And then, pag nag-combine na sila all together, C5 convertase, dire-diretso na yan. I-cleave na niya si C5, tapos i-attract ni C5 si 6, 7, 8, 9. And yung C5 to C9 is termed as the membrane attack complex. Di ba yung sa end part, dito sa right side, magagawa yan sila ng hole so that the pathogen will be lysed. Okay? Sige, makikita niyo yan sa ulit later. Ito. So, yan. Hindi siya nag-play. Kailangan ko siya i-click. So, ulit, yung C3, ulit. Si may antigen, tapos may antibody. Ngayon, si antibody will trigger the activation of C1. Ngayon, si C1q will create a complex with QRS. Tapos, i-activate niya C4, and then C2, and then C3. Pero ang kailangan lang natin dito is your C4b, C2a, and C3b. So, ang nangyayari, as a side bit, yung C3a, di ba hindi man natin yung ginamit? Ang ginamit natin for the complement pathway is si C3b. So, si C3a will trigger the release of granules by basophil and mast cells, which will help further vasodilation and vasopermeability. So, ang tawag natin doon, anaphylatoxin. Okay? Sige. So, ngayon, yung C5 convertase will trigger the cleavage of C5b and C5a. So, magkakaroon tayo ng release ni C5b and C5a. So, si C5a, hindi natin yan gagamitin. Marirelease din yan sa periphery and will serve also as a potent anaphylatoxin and a chemoattractant for neutrophils. So, wala tayong waste product dito. Lahat ng hindi natin dinadala doon sa complexes will be used to call other cells or degranulate other cells. So, ito na yung C5 and C6, C7, and we'll call the assembly of the C9, which will actually be the direct one to create a hole in the surface of the bacteria, causing cell lysis. Okay. So, ganito ang itsura under the scanning electron microscope. merong mga holes ang bacteria. So, yan yung classical pathway. So, ano yung three main parts? Recognition, activation, and membrane attack complex. So, sa recognition, ang members natin are the C1QRS. Ina-activate nila yung C4, C2, up to C3. So, activation part na si C4, C2 hanggang kay C3. So, pag magtatanong kayo kung saan yung activation unit nagsa-start, pag nag-bind na si C4b kay C2a. Pag meron na tayong C3 convertase. And ang membrane attack complex nagsa-start kay C5b. So, ang membrane attack complex unit is your C5b, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay? So, yung second picture, yan yung initiation or recognition. Yung third picture, yan na yung activation. And yung fourth picture, yan na yung membrane attack complex. Sige. So, these are comparisons of the pathway complement activation ng alternative versus classical. So, ang difference kay alternative pathway, ang previous name ni alternative pathway is properdin pathway because there is an involvement of the protein properdin. So, di ba sabi natin si alternative pathway will not need yung presence of antibody. So, ang nangyayari dito, ang start agad na activation is through the activation of C3. So, si C3 will be triggered or activated by the substances found sa bacterial cell wall. So, si C3 magiging C3b, C3a. Pero ang kailangan lang natin is si C3b. So, si C3b will further cleave the factor BB and then magkakaroon tayo ng C3b, BB. So, sa alternative pathway, marami tayong B. So, si C3b, BB, yun yung C3 convertase ng alternative pathway. So, ano nga yung C3 convertase ng classical pathway?
C4B2A po.
Okay. So, C3 convertase ng classical pathway si C4B2A. Pero pag tinanong, ano yung C3 convertase ng alternative pathway? C3B, BB. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, kung C3 convertase pa lang siya, ibabind niya pa further si C3 ulit. So, magiging C3B, BB, C3B. So, yun na yung C5 convertase. So, kung sa classical pathway, ang C5 convertase is C4B2A3B. Sa alternative, C3B, BB, C3B. Pero ang end part, same pa din. Kailangan nilang i-activate si C5 to become 5B, tapos bubuo tayo ng membrane attack complex. So, kailan nagsa-start kay classical? Antigen-antibody complex, binding C1. Kay alternative pathway, yung cell wall or microbial surface will trigger the activation of C3 to become C3b. Okay. So, ang mga main anaphylotoxins natin sa classical, C2A, and C5A. Okay? Yung hindi natin ginamit. Yung pinamigay natin kasi C2B ang kailangan natin and C5B. So these are the general features of your complement activation. They are cascade of enzymatic activities and they are sites of biologic function. So, ito yung general components of your complement proteins. Okay, C1QRS. So, your C1Q, take note lang, is a polymer of 6 identical subunits. And C1Q will create C1QRS complex to trigger C4. So, ulit lang yung antibody natin na pwede lang maging classical component activator, IgM, IgG1, 2, 3. So, 4 lang sila. So, this is another illustration of the C1 structure binding to the antigen-antibody complex. So, again, C1QRS, tapos it activates si C4A, C4B, pero ang ibabind niya si C4. Wait lang ha. Parang iba ito na ano. Illustration. Okay, sige. C4B, 2A. 2A ito dapat. Bakit ito 2B? Sige. C4B2A ang C3 convertase ha. Question. Ay, mag-aalis na kayo? Uy, malapit na kayo mag-time, no? Wala, may klase kayo, di ba?
Yes po, Doc. CC po.
Ay, sige. 2 minutes na lang. Tama? Sige. Dito na lang tayo sa ano, sa problems. Kung kulang tayo ng ulit. Itong summary of the functions of the extra na complement components. Yung C3b, pwede rin siyang maging opsonization protein. Yung C5a is a chemotaxin and yung C3a and C5a are anaphylotoxins. Okay? And ang ending, ang cellular lysis is for the action of MAC, membrane attack complex. Take note of these following disease associations. Kung may problema tayo or kulang yung C1QRS, usually ang problem natin nagkakaroon ng recurrent infection or SLE. Tapos dito sa C3, severe recurrent infection or severe combined immunodeficiency. Ha? Pero nasa book niyo yan lahat. So, wag niyo lang kalimutan baka. Daanan niyo lang yan na table. Importante yan. Mga disease associations na associated with complement protein deficiencies. So, nakalagay dyan, ang wala lang dyan ako na flash screen is yung 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Ang usual na problem nila are Neisseria and pneumococcal infections. So, ano ibig sabihin nun? Neisseria and pneumococcal infections, yung mga encapsulated na mga organisms. Okay. Sige. It is 2:50 and it is time for your CC. Thank you for listening, 3E, and there will be video lectures fun in your classroom. Bye-bye.
Bye, Doc.
Thank you po, Doc. Bye po, Doc. Bye po,
Bye-bye.
Doc. Bye, Doc.
Same classroom lang kayo?
Opo, Doc. Doc, picture daw, Doc.
Ay, wait lang.
General.
Ani, Doc.
1, 2, 3. What's up, Doc? 1, 2, 3.
Thanks, Doc.
Wait. Ano? Ayun naman. Tara.
I-take na mo.